Over the Mediterranean Sea in early June of 1805, a languid, viscous haze hung, dissolving the horizon and hopes. Here, off the coast of North Africa, the sun didn't just shine, it pressed down, pinning the heavy wooden hulls of American frigates drifting in the roadstead of Tripoli to the water. The hot wind, the sirocco, carrying the finest dust from the depths of the Sahara, covered the decks with a thin, reddish film that grated on the sailors' teeth and clogged the seams of parade uniforms. On board the flagship Constitution, a tense silence reigned, broken only by the lapping of waves against the sides and the rare, abrupt commands of the watch officers. But this was not the silence of peace. This was the silence of a string stretched to its limit, ready to snap at the slightest careless touch. In the luxurious but stuffy Commodore's cabin, converted into a diplomatic game headquarters, sat Tobias Lear, a man to whom fate and President Thomas Jefferson had entrusted the task of untying the knot that had been tightening around the young republic's neck for 4 long, bloody, and ruinous years. Before Lear, on the polished table, lay maps, stacks of dispatches, and drafts of letters scrawled with notes. But he saw not the papers. His inner gaze was fixed on what lay beyond the narrow embrasures of Tripoli's fortress walls, visible in the haze. There, in damp casemates, in conditions degrading human dignity, 307 American citizens, the crew of the ill-fated frigate _1_, languished. Their fate had become not just a humanitarian problem, but a bleeding wound of national pride. Every day of their captivity was a slap in America's face, a demonstration of powerlessness in the face of a barbaric force that for centuries had dictated its terms to the greatest monarchies of Europe. Lear felt this burden physically. He knew that in Washington, in Philadelphia, in Boston, thousands of eyes were fixed on him with a silent question: when will they return? And he knew that every step he took would be scrutinized under the microscope of history. He had to do the impossible: buy peace from a tyrant without calling it tribute, rescue hostages without showing weakness, and end a war that was draining the treasury without having the authority for a full-scale invasion. To understand the full depth of the drama unfolding these June days, it is necessary to delve into the context that brought the American fleet to these hostile shores. The United States, having barely gained independence, faced the harsh reality of geopolitics. Deprived of the protection of the British fleet, American merchant ships became easy prey for the corsairs of the Barbary coast, semi-autonomous provinces of the Ottoman Empire that made maritime piracy the basis of their economy. Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli. These names struck terror into the hearts of New England merchants. The system was simple and cynical. Pay an annual tribute, and your ships would be untouched. Refuse, and you would get captured ships and citizens in chains for whom you would have to pay a ransom at triple the price. European powers, Britain, France, Holland, had played this game for centuries, preferring to buy their way out as it was cheaper than war, and cynically using pirates as a tool to pressure competitors. But America, born under the slogans of freedom and human rights, perceived this demand as an existential challenge. Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. This slogan became the motto of the era. However, slogans are good at rallies, but reality demanded a fleet, cannons, and, as it turned out, flexible diplomacy. The culmination of this confrontation was the catastrophe of October 31st, 1803, when the frigate Philadelphia, under the command of William Bainbridge, while pursuing a corsair vessel, ran aground on an uncharted reef in Tripoli harbor. Attempts to refloat the ship failed, and one of the most powerful ships of the American fleet, along with its entire crew, fell into enemy hands. This event turned the chessboard upside down. Pasha Yusuf Karamanli gained a trump card of incredible power. Now he could dictate terms not as a petitioner, but as the master of the situation. 300 lives on one side of the scale, national honor on the other. For a year and a half, America tried to solve this problem by force. Bombardments of the city, Stephen Decatur's daring raid to destroy the captured _to_ a naval blockade. But the walls of Tripoli stood strong, and the Pasha's resolve seemed unshakable. The war had reached a stalemate, from which Tobias Lear was to find a way out. However, by the summer of 1805, the situation began to change, and from an unexpected quarter. A third force entered the equation, confounding all the players. William Eaton, a former consul, a man of restless energy, an adventurer, and a visionary, undertook a desperate march across the Libyan desert. Allied with the exiled brother of the Pasha, Hamet Karamanli, he assembled a motley army of 8 Marines, Greek mercenaries, and Arab cavalrymen. This foreign legion accomplished the impossible. After hundreds of miles across scorching sands, they stormed the city of Derna, the second most important center of Tripolitania. For the first time, the American flag was raised over a captured fortress in the Old World. Eaton had no intention of stopping. He was preparing a march on Tripoli, planning to overthrow Yusuf and place the loyal Hamet on the throne. This prospect instilled terror in the heart of the Pasha. He understood that his power, built on fear, could collapse like a house of cards if the people saw an alternative. The threat from land proved more formidable than cannons from the sea. It was at this moment, when the scales began to tip in favor of a forceful solution, that Tobias Lear decided to act diplomatically. Here we encounter the deepest internal conflict of this story. On one side was Eaton, a romantic warrior believing in honor, in a given word, in the necessity of complete victory and regime change. He saw the war as a crusade for justice. On the other side was Lear, a pragmatist, a bureaucrat, a man of instructions. He knew that Jefferson did not want an occupation of Tripoli. The president feared that by placing a puppet on the throne, the U.S. would be obliged to perpetually support him with bayonets, getting entangled in endless African intrigues. Lear considered Eaton's plan too risky and expensive. His task was specific: to retrieve the prisoners and make peace. If this meant betraying an ally and paying an enemy, well, such was the price of state interests. This conflict between idealism and realism, between an officer's honor and a politician's calculation, became the nerve of the war's final days. Negotiations began in an atmosphere of extreme secrecy and mutual distrust. The Danish consul, Nikolai Nissen, a man of rare integrity who had helped the American prisoners survive all these years, acted as an intermediary. White-flagged sloops plied between the Constitution and the shore, carrying messages, every word of which was weighed on apothecary scales. Yusuf Karamanli, feeling Eaton's pressure from the east and the blockade from the sea, began to lower his demands. If he had previously asked for millions, now it was hundreds of thousands. Lear was unyielding. He was playing poker, holding strong cards but knowing that time was working against him. Commodore Samuel Barron, the formal commander of the squadron, was dying of liver disease and had effectively transferred authority to Lear. This placed a double responsibility on the diplomat. He had to make decisions for the fleet without being a sailor himself. On May 29th, tension reached its peak. Lear sent a final ultimatum to shore. He declared that America would not pay a single cent for peace. A peace treaty must be concluded on terms of equality and mutual respect, without annual tribute. However, the issue of prisoners required a special solution. Lear proposed an exchange scheme. The Americans held about 100 Tripolitan prisoners. The Pasha held 307 Americans. Lear proposed exchanging them on a man-for-man basis and paying a ransom for the difference in numbers, about 200 people. The sum was set at $60,000. This was a critical distinction, paying not for peace, but for the ransom of people. Semantics played a decisive role here. For the American voter, the word ransom was acceptable. It was the salvation of fellow citizens. The word tribute was political death. Awaiting a response, the hours on the Constitution dragged agonizingly slowly. Officers peered at the shore through spyglasses, trying to catch movement on the fortress walls. Sailors discussed rumors. Would the Pasha lower the flag? Would the batteries open fire? Lear locked himself in his cabin, rereading the draft treaty. He understood that these $60,000 would be a stain on his reputation. He would be accused of having bought what the fleet could have taken by force. But he also thought of Bainbridge and his men. Another week, another month in those pits, and many of them might not return. And a storming of the city, which Eaton advocated, could lead to a massacre of hostages. Lear chose a bird in the hand, the guaranteed return of the men, even at the cost of a deal with his conscience. On June 3, 1805, a boat with the Pasha's envoy approached the frigate's side. The answer was positive. Yusuf Karamanli capitulated to circumstances. He agreed to $60,000 and the abandonment of future tribute. But this coin also had a flip side, dark and tragic. One of the secret conditions of the treaty was the U.S.'s commitment to evacuate troops from Derna and cease all support for Hamet. American diplomacy coldly sold its ally for peace with his enemy. When the order to retreat reached Eaton in Derna, his fury knew no bounds. He screamed about dishonor, about betrayal, about Washington stabbing heroes in the back. He had to resort to cunning to get his Marines onto the ships, leaving Hamet's army on shore in complete ignorance. When the Arabs realized the Americans were leaving, panic broke out on the shore. Hamet, a man who believed America's word, was forced to flee to Egypt, saving his life, abandoned and forgotten by those who had promised him the throne. But in the harbor of Tripoli, very different emotions reigned in those days. The process of freeing the captives became a scene of biblical proportions. As the prison doors swung open, people who had spent 19 months in semi-darkness squinted at the bright sun, disbelieving their eyes. They emerged, dirty, overgrown, emaciated by disease and meager rations, but not broken in spirit. Captain William Bainbridge, who all this time had carried the heavy cross of guilt for the loss of his ship, led his men to the pier. There, longboats awaited them. When the oars touched the water and the boats moved towards the American squadron, a reverent silence hung over the harbor, which soon exploded with shouts of joy. Boarding the Constitution was a moment of truth. Sailors from the frigate, many of whom had lost friends on the Philadelphia, embraced the freedmen like brothers. Tears streamed down the weathered faces of stern men unaccustomed to sentimentality. Officers shook hands, clapped shoulders. The squadron's doctor immediately began examining the former prisoners. Each was offered fresh bread, clean water, a change of clothes. This moment of unity, a moment of their own returning, became a powerful catalyst for national self-awareness. People from Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New York realized themselves not just as inhabitants of individual states, but as citizens of one nation that does not abandon its own. The flag, unfurling at the stern, acquired a new, sacred meaning in their eyes. It became a symbol of protection, a symbol that America's hand would reach to any corner of the globe to save its sons. However, when the euphoria of the first days subsided, it was time for reflection. The treaty signed by Lear was a complex document. Yes, it ended the war. Yes, it brought back the people. Yes, it abolished the annual tribute. This was an undeniable success, especially against the backdrop of how the European powers behaved. Europe was shocked. British diplomats in their reports to London wrote with bewilderment and hidden respect that these upstart republicans had forced the barbarians to respect them. French observers noted the growth of U.S. naval power. A precedent was set. Pirates could not only be bargained with, they could be compelled to peace. The myth of the invincibility of the Barbary bays cracked. But within the United States itself, the reaction was mixed. When the details of the deal became known, the country was divided. The opposition attacked the Jefferson administration, calling the payment of $60,000 a veiled tribute and a disgrace. The fate of Hamet Karamanli became the subject of heated debate in Congress. William Eaton, upon returning home, became a hero in the eyes of the people, but a political outcast for the authorities. He publicly accused Lear of cowardice and incompetence. "We held a sword to the tyrant's throat, and you paid him to take it away," Eaton thundered in taverns and at meetings. This polemic laid the groundwork for future discussions about U.S. foreign policy. Where is the line between ideals and interests? Is it permissible to betray friends for profit? What is more important, clean hands or saved lives? Tobias Lear found himself at the epicenter of this storm. His career was tainted, though he had followed all presidential instructions. History is often unfair to those who do the dirty work of diplomacy. Lear understood what Eaton refused to see. America in 1805 was not yet a superpower. It lacked the resources for a prolonged occupation and regime change. The nation's economy needed peace and free trade, not the glory of conquerors. Lear's decision was a victory of realism over romanticism. It allowed the fleet to return home, regroup, and prepare for a much more serious challenge: the impending War of 1812 with Great Britain. The experience gained by officers and sailors in the Mediterranean waters proved invaluable. It was there, in battles with Tripoli's gunboats, that a generation of naval commanders was forged, who, a few years later, would fight on equal terms with the Stephen Decatur, Isaac Hull, William Bainbridge. All of them went through the school of the Barbary Wars. Looking at events from the vantage point of 2 centuries, we see their astonishing relevance. The First Barbary War became a prototype for many modern conflicts. It was an asymmetrical war, a regular fleet against paramilitary formations using tactics of terror and hostage-taking. It was a war for freedom of navigation, for the right to move goods and ideas unhindered. And finally, it was a war that posed an eternal question to a democratic society. What is the value of a citizen's life, and what is the state willing to sacrifice to save it? The answer given in 1805 was a compromise, imperfect, painful, but it worked. The squadron's return to America was a triumph. Newspapers were full of headlines. Bainbridge and his officers were acquitted by a naval court for the loss of the ship, as they did everything possible in impossible circumstances. The Philadelphia itself, burned by Decatur, remained at the bottom of Tripoli harbor as a monument to courage and tragedy. But the main outcome was not in ships or money. The main outcome was mental. The young nation believed in its strength. It understood that it could project its will thousands of miles from its native shores. It realized that international respect is not given by birthright. It must be earned, sometimes with iron, sometimes with gold, but always with fortitude. However, the story of the Barbary coast did not end there. The peace turned out to be merely an armistice. Yusuf Karamanli, having licked his wounds and spent American dollars, soon returned to his old habits. Algiers and Tunis, emboldened by the Americans' departure, resumed their attacks. It took another 10 years and another war, the Second Barbary War of 1815, to finally put an end to it. Then Stephen Decatur would return to the Mediterranean with a new squadron and would no longer engage in lengthy negotiations. He would simply position his ships alongside the Algerian fleet and issue an ultimatum: peace without ransoms or total annihilation. And then, remembering the lessons of 1805, the Corsairs would capitulate unconditionally. But that decisive triumph of 1815 grew from the seeds sown by Lear's compromise. It was necessary to go through mistakes, through the humiliation of ransom, through the pain of an ally's betrayal, to crystallize that steely foreign policy that would become the hallmark of the USA. As the last ships of the American squadron disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving behind the minarets and palm trees of Tripoli, night descended upon the sea. The stars, the very ones that guided sailors across the Atlantic, reflected in the dark water, washing away the traces of human passions. The waves continued their eternal run, indifferent to treaties and borders. But the world had changed. A new constant had appeared in it. The peoples of Europe and Africa saw that in the West, across the ocean, a power had grown that could not be ignored. This power was still young, impetuous, making mistakes, but it learned quickly. And the lesson of Tripoli was learned perfectly. Freedom is not just a word in a declaration. It is a state that must be defended every day, on every sea, against any tyrant who dares to infringe on a person's right to be free. Closing this chapter of history, we cannot help but think about the fate of ordinary people caught in the millstones of history, of the sailors whose names have faded from memory, but whose suffering in captivity became the cement of American statehood, of Hamet Karamanli, who ended his life in the poverty of exile, becoming an eternal reproach to the conscience of politicians, of William Eaton, who died in obscurity and alcoholism, never forgiving his country for the stolen victory. Their personal tragedies intertwined into a single canvas of great history, reminding us that behind every line in a textbook are living people, their pain, their choices, and their sacrifices. And that is why we must remember this war, not as a set of dates and battles, but as a complex, multifaceted drama about the formation of a nation, about finding its place in the world, and about the price that must be paid for the right to be called free. The First Barbary War ended, but the echo of its shots and the rustle of its diplomatic papers are still heard today, reminding us that history never definitively passes into the past. It lives in the present, determining our future.